Hello, I'm John Roach, and I'll be presenting on organochlorine pesticide, or OCP, use and pollution in the Yucatan Peninsula. So just a brief outline of what I'll be covering today. I'll start by setting the background for OCP use in the Yucatan and how that interacts with the groundwater system. And then I'll go more specifically into the issue of OCP use in Maya farming communities. I'll talk about the big picture impacts of OCP pollution for the entire Yucatan Peninsula, and then I'll close with potential solutions and things to think about moving forward with this issue. So fairly recently, the Yucatan has experienced a rapid increase in agricultural production, and alongside that boom, there's also been a boom in pesticide usage to keep up. Many of the pesticides used have been banned all around the world, and sometimes even in Mexico, but the government hasn't done a great job of regulating pesticide usage or even properly educating farming communities on their risks or proper usage. I'll be focusing on OCPs in particular because they are a banned substance that potentially have the harshest impact on the water supply and the people of the Yucatan. So a little bit about the groundwater system in the Yucatan. We're pretty familiar with it by now, but as we know, the geology of the Yucatan is karstic, meaning that its landscape is made up of big slabs of limestone, kind of like Kentucky. The limestone is extremely permeable, so the recharge water doesn't go through much filtration at all when entering the groundwater system. In the context of OCP pollution, this lack of filtration is a huge issue. And looking at the right side of this diagram, you see precipitation can come down. It would wash these chemicals off of the crops and recharge them into the groundwater system. And there's also a process in which the pesticides, the OCPs, are sprayed or evaporated and end up in the atmosphere, but they'd still be brought down by precipitation and eventually into the groundwater system. And since this limestone is so permeable, it offers very little resistance or filtration against the OCP contamination. So while students like myself and researchers have access to the processes of groundwater contamination, it's the rural farming communities that often don't. However, they're the ones using OCPs. In particular, Maya farming communities are largely uninformed about the consequences of applying OCPs, and a lot of this stems from the fact that general education levels are so low. Angel Polanco Rodriguez, he did a study in 2014 on Maya farming communities around the Ring of Cenotes, and he found that 45% of the community members were illiterate, while 55% have not completed basic education. And he never really defines what this basic education is, but I'm assuming at best it's what we would consider a high school diploma. In his interviews with community members, Rodriguez found that one of the most widespread misbeliefs in the area was that pesticides simply just don't disintegrate after they're sprayed, as in they don't believe that they linger in the atmosphere, nor do they end up in the groundwater. And I want to point out some of the most striking numbers here. First, 94% of the people interviewed don't think that agrochemicals or pesticides will pollute the groundwater. 2/3 think that pesticides don't harm human health. And 87% share the belief that wind can just carry the pesticides away or that those pesticides dissolve in the air. This lack of knowledge about the risk and consequences of OCPs is pretty concerning, especially when taking into account the fact that almost 30% of this rural Mayan population near the Ring of Cenotes drinks from contaminated wells or springs. So effectively what's happening is Maya farmers are unknowingly contaminating their own drinking water and putting their families at risk. We also know that the groundwater is connected throughout the Yucatan Peninsula, so the contamination isn't just staying in these rural areas. We've seen the figure below, and I'll make it larger. And you see this ring, this is the Ring of Cenotes. Many of the farming communities are right here. And the groundwater flows towards the coast through big metropolitan areas such as Mérida. And these urban populations already have issues with using the city water for drinking, but they'd also put themselves at risk of OCP consumption if they drank well water. That's a big part of the reason why we see families spend so much money on bottled water in urban areas. So I've talked a lot about OCP pollution being a bad thing, but it's important for me to explain why it's a public health risk. For one, organochlorines are bioaccumulative, meaning that they build up in body tissue over time. They aren't excreted. And there's actually already evidence that it is accumulating in people of the Yucatan. So Rodriguez, he did another study, this time in these three metropolitan area, or these three different areas around the Yucatan. One is this metropolitan area right next to Merida. There's a coastal area, and then there's an agricultural area. And what he found is that 80% of the samples contained OCP. Oh, I didn't even say what he studied. He studied breast milk samples from women in these communities, and what he was looking for was OCP residues. He found that about 80% of the samples contained OCP residues, and that the highest concentration was actually in this metropolitan area. So this means that OCPs are being consumed, and it's not just in the agricultural areas where they're applied. So potential complications from OCP consumption in humans is sometimes, it's pretty difficult to study because there's always external forces that could be causing or exacerbating health issues, and it's really hard to just pinpoint something to OCP consumption. Still, researchers have found OCPs to be endocrine disruptors, meaning that they alter hormone levels in the body, and this can lead to infertility or endometriosis. Scientists have also observed carcinogenic and gene-inducing effects in the OCPs. That correlates with OCP consumption with cancers of reproductive systems of both the male and female. Since OCPs have been found in breast milk, it's also important to understand the effects that consumption may have on young children. Researchers have a basis to suspect correlation between OCP consumption and autism spectrum disorder, as well as ADHD. Generally, neonatal exposure to OCPs has been associated with deficits in language and memory skills in young children. Keep in mind that these communities that are most affected, deeply affected, and the most exposed to OCP pollution are marginalized communities, so developmental roadblocks will only continue to expose the disparity present. So for impactful change to occur, the government will need to step in and policy will need to be updated. However, governments, for the most part, tend to wait for strong scientific evidence of harm before taking action. And like I talked about, it's really hard to pinpoint OCP pollution as the root of these different effects we're seeing. But UNESCO has initiated a project in some marginalized communities that depend on natural water resources for drinking. And that project is called Emerging Pollutants in Water and Wastewater. And it hasn't been taken to the Yucatan. One of the big focuses of the project is to implement new technologies in order to better demonstrate the prevalence and impacts of pollution. And then they can use these results to help governments move ahead with updating the policies. And another portion of the UNESCO program is dedicated to educating the general public. So I think whether or not it's UNESCO, a similar program should be initiated in the peninsula. Education should specifically target Maya farming communities, and the policy on OCP should be tightened, while also keeping in mind the needs of the farmers. And that brings me to things to think about moving forward. And these aren't things I've researched, but I think they're important to keep in mind. And the first is what will happen when the farmers lose access to OCPs? How will they bounce back and continue to maintain the production necessary? What about the corporations who sue local farmers if they use copyrighted seeds to kind of keep up production? But finally, most important, we must keep in mind that OCP pollution won't only impact the marginalized communities. We can't just turn a blind eye to it and expect it to kind of not affect us. The groundwater systems are interconnected, so pollution in a poor Maya farming community will with certainty lead to pollution of the groundwater in even the wealthiest parts of northern Merida. Thank you, and have a nice night.